We're going to start today, certainly with somebody I know very well from the university that many people call the University of Graz in Austria. Georg Marko is going to talk to us about from I felt it pulse to this reflex alteration in heart rate, depersonalization as a conceptual strategy in medical writing from 1700 to 1900, a corpus-based approach. Good.
So it's a long title. So this is going to be a talk about the differences in the roles that humans play in medical texts, represented by the two quotes in the title and represented by these two passages. The first one, humans are very prominent, kind of realized by references to them with personal pronouns and nouns. The second one, humans are not that prominent. It's created by constructions like nominalizations, references to body parts, agentless passives, technical terms, and things like that. So the actual starting point of this presentation or this study is an article that was published in 1976 by actually not Daniel Jewson, but Nicholas Jewson, called The Disappearance of the Sick Man from Medical Cosmology, 1770 to 1870. And he basically proposed or suggested that between 1770 and 1870, the perspective of medicine changed dramatically, with the patient as a human being increasingly being backgrounded. And he thought that this actually happened in three phases. The first one was actually the starting point of bedside, he called bedside medicine. Second one, hospital medicine, then later on in the 19th century, transferring to laboratory medicine. So the first stage, bedside medicine, he defined as medicine is actually practiced in patient's home. Kind of a caveat, of course, this is rich people or rich patients, because not everybody could afford that. And medicine was based on patients' own accounts or their stories, and doctors' holistic interpretation of diseases. So they took into account many different aspects of the patient's lives. Then after the revolutions, hospitals became a thing, or more fashionable. Hospitals as places where they concentrated patients, decontextualized them and isolated them from the non-sick or from the rest of society. And medicine was based on the physical examination of patients' bodies and doctors' analytical, or some may say reductionist interpretations of the disease, with a much more focus on the disease rather than on patients as human beings. Didn't work here. So the stethoscope is a new invention. It was kind of symbolized this kind of new type of medicine. And about mid-19th century, that kind of at least another aspect was added. Laboratory medicine was actually not the whole body was examined, but partly it was parts of bodies that was kind of transferred to laboratories and kind of analyzed there. So medicine is practiced in laboratories, at least partly, and based on the biochemical and histological examination of patients' body fluids and tissue samples. And again, scientists, not necessarily practitioners, analytical interpretations of diseases. Actually, this is a philosophical perspective. It's a very negative perspective. It kind of leaves out a lot of things. However, it's an interesting lens through which to look at texts from the 18th and 19th century on medicine. So he basically, actually, the microscope is, of course, the symbol for laboratory medicine, invented or kind of improved during that period. And he actually saw kind of a transition of the roles of patients and doctors, but it's the more interesting one is in person. In bedside medicine, case in hospital medicine, and cell complex in laboratory medicine. I would call it sample, so person's case sample. This transition, kind of where the person as a whole human being disappeared in his analysis. So he basically argued for a certain amount of depersonalization in medicine. That means that's the conceptual strategy of dissociating medicine and perhaps all matters relevant to the health domain from the concrete experiences of humans as cognitive, emotional, and social beings. Depersonalization is, of course, not kind of a monolithic process. There are kind of different aspects, and I think the following probably important. Human agency is important, and here depersonalization means backgrounding human involvement, participation, and agency in the world. Holism is important, so seeing people as whole persons. Here depersonalization means backgrounding people as holistic, social, and ecological beings. Human individuality, where depersonalization means backgrounding concrete individual human beings, and human subjectivity, where it means backgrounding to human experience and their life worlds. Of course, the axiom that I'm starting from as a linguist is always that sociocultural changes in any domain are based on changes in conceptualizations, for styles, ideologies, perspectives, worldviews, which in turn are constructed by and reflected in language use in text. That's why when you're interested in depersonalization, or if I'm interested and I'm looking at texts. So the research question is basically how, when, and to what extent can we see development towards more depersonalization in the language use in medicine from 1700 to 1900. Or in more linguistic terms, how, when, and to what extent does the use of linguistic elements, constructions, and features that we can argue contribute to depersonalization change in medical texts from 1700 to 1900? Actually contributing to depersonalization or the opposite, because you might also see features that actually decrease in frequencies. Medical texts here means medical articles for all the reasons that I'm not going into, but most important one being that it's developed. It was an emergent genre during that period, and it was developed into the ideal medium for disseminating new scientific knowledge quickly and in a compact form. So if it kind of represented medicine and the state of the art in medicine, so if it's there, if there is the depersonalization, it should be there as well. The methodology that I studied is the corpus-based discourse analysis, critical discourse analysis, because that's my identity, or CATS, if you like, corpus-assisted discourse studies as a established term. So the purpose is, or the objective is, to find morphosyntactic, semantic, lexical, pragmatic patterns in representative corpus and relating them to meanings and interpretations that may be seen as having sociocultural significance. I take a very deductive approach, so that means that I'm starting from a preconception, namely this conceptualization, depersonalization, and I also start from the assumption that there are certain linguistic elements that might contribute. So kind of a focused view, but also kind of a partly reductionist view as well. The corpus I'm using is a self-compiled one, where the basic idea is that I wanted to represent each year from 1700 to 1900 by one article. And I used articles from the Philosophical Transactions of the Royal Society for the 18th century and for the beginning of the 19th century, because that was where there were more things happening, but for the 19th century, also taking into account specialized medical journals emerging during that time. So Lancet, New England Journal of Medicine, British Medical Journal, etc. And take into account the generic and thematic variability of articles of the period. That was the basic idea. However, things are a lot messier in real life because of limitations, because that was not kind of a project that I did for here, but it was kind of happened in 3 stages. And always for a presentation where it kind of worked under a certain amount of time pressure. So I didn't have a kind of fixed plan beforehand and had enough time to carry that out. And of course, it depends on the availability of text versions and the transformability of PDF, of facsimile. versions of the text as we talked yesterday. So basically the result is that it's a more messy corpus than the plan suggested. Especially the texts differ quite widely in length. So it's partly 200 words and partly 10,000 words. I try to avoid these kind of lectures that are sometimes included in, because they go on for 80 pages or something. Just for the information, that's the journals, or the number of articles that I included. So a heavy focus, of course, on the philosophical transactions, but that's because it's the 18th century is exclusively represented by that. Just the statistical info, it's 201 articles actually, because I included 1700 and 1900. And the overall size is 533,000 words. The average length, 2,500 words, but kind of, as I said, like ranging from 150 to 11,000. And I didn't balance it, so I didn't take like a certain amount of words from each article because I wanted to have the whole. It's annotated kind of manually for structure and POS tagged with W matrix 5. And I looked at the following elements, and I tried to assign a certain number to each of these aspects that I mentioned: human agency, holism, individuality, and subjectivity. So, with respect to agency, I looked at nominalizations and passive voice. With fragmentation, I looked at nouns denoting body parts. With individualization, I looked at proper names, titles. That's more for the individualization, and for de-individualization, the relationship of plural nouns as opposed to singular nouns, and present tense as opposed to past tense, because I assume that if you want to talk more generally about something, you are more likely to use plural nouns than singular nouns. If you want to talk about something more generally, you tend to use generic present tense rather than past tense. And subjectification, use of first and second person pronouns, evaluative adjectives, and technical terms. So Latin foreign words and neoclassical compounds. And I'll get to that, what these are. The procedure was all features are examined and counted for each of the 20 decades from 1700 to 1900. And all the numbers are normalized with the exception of percentages and represent occurrences per 10,000 words. So if you just see numbers, these are occurrences per 10,000 words. Now I'll kind of look at one aspect for each of these 4 categories and kind of quickly pass through the slides with the data on the others. So nominalization very quickly means turning a word into a noun by derivation, which means suffixation in English, or conversion, and focuses on deverbal nominalization. So the base word is a verb. So basically from to arrive to arrival. Why nominalization in the context of depersonalization? First of all, nominalization presents something as a process, a dynamic process, as something pretty abstract. And secondly, and perhaps more importantly, the nominalization means that you don't have to mention the semantic roles, such as agents or patients, which are typically represented by human beings. So I observe something or somebody turns into an observation where you don't have to mention who is the observer or who is the observed. Technical details, of course, you can't actually cover all of the nominalization because there are some idiosyncratic ones, but these are the kind of suffixes that are looked at. And here are the results. You see a certain kind of step upwards where we might expect that kind of the transition to hospital medicine around in the 1790s. And 1800s, but it kind of remains relatively stable, but it's actually overall, it's not kind of very impressive at all. So it's not like there has been, or there had been a change or kind of increase in use, but not kind of dramatically. Okay. Problems, of course, is there are lots of non-participle nominalizations. Nouns that formally are related to verbs, but which have developed idiosyncratic meanings and only vaguely relate to the meaning of the verb. And these tend to be high frequency. So things like generation and inflammation, and you have to make a decision whether you include them or not. If you exclude them, then you run into kind of all kinds of problems because you don't know exactly where to draw the line. So that kind of makes the results messy. Passive voice, no change, practically no change. It's actually not passive voice, it's agentless passive voice, so without the by prepositional phrase. Second, nouns denoting body parts. So there's something to do with fragmentation or seeing people as whole. So nouns that are used to refer to body and its parts. This includes external components, organs, tissue, biochemistry, or microstructures. Body parts and noun and depersonalization, the more we talk about refer to the body and its part, the less we are concerned with whole human beings, and which creates a fragmented perspective. Technical aspects, so well, how did I look for that? I actually looked at the word list for the whole corpus for all the 200 articles and looked for those that kind of had been tagged for as a noun. And then I kind of looked through the whole list and selected those that kind of refer to body parts. And then I used that as a search list for going through the decade by decade aspect. Again, a kind of underwhelming results, not kind of, there doesn't seem to be a clear development towards more focus on the body. If there had been any kind of less focus on that. Problems, of course, there might be shifts in focus on the body from large scale parts to internal organs, because so it didn't kind of look at the more qualitative aspects here. But if you look at the first few words, there seem to be certain kind of tendencies, for example, gut not being used as a technical term, but otherwise it's not kind of significant in this respect. More interesting, if you kind of relate body parts to their possessor, so it's a body part with possessive pronoun or a genitive, then you see a kind of a strong development towards less of that. I think I skipped proper names because no clear development here either. So there's no kind of clear development towards less or fewer use, decreased use of proper names. Not even, so that's the relation of first names and surnames, not even with, perhaps a little bit with percentages of surnames with titles. Problems, of course, there might be two competing dimensions involving proper names, naming patients and witnesses in the first part, and towards naming and quoting peers towards the later parts of the 19th century. That's, I'm not talking about that. It's a more interesting thing. Like here you see kind of the relationship of past tense and present tense, and this present tense is simple and no perfect aspect. There seems to be a development towards more use of present tense around 1800. No changes in the relationship of singular and plural nouns. Evaluative adjectives are adjectives. Let's define a part like the adjectives that express a mostly subjective evaluation. These include clear and foregrounded judgments on value, aesthetics, character, emotions, importance, quantity, and intensity, or fittingness as well. Clearly, there is a correlation of evaluative adjectives and depersonalization because evaluative adjectives involve subjectification or subjective judgment. That's why it's interesting. I took the same approach as with body parts. I looked through the whole list of adjectives for the whole corpus and select those that are subjective, and then use that as a search list for the individual decades. Results, no development or clear development at all. So it's not kind of that we have fewer evaluative adjectives towards in the course of the whole 2 centuries. Problems, there might have been shifts in focus of different types of evaluation, and possibly from more to less subjective ones, so wonderful and extraordinary towards good and important, etc. I didn't look kind of more into kind of specifically about there's certain tendencies here, but not kind of clear ones. The other elements, first person pronouns goes down, the usage, the singular one more than the plural one. Second person pronouns not that relevant because it doesn't occur that often. Actually, other thing that I looked at kind of have the opposite view. Because if you use a lot of technical terminology, then you kind of remove medicine from the life world of people. Latin terms for anatomy did not go down. Did not go up actually dramatically, because of course the tradition of representing science in Latin kind of lived on. Having neoclassical compounds, that these words kind of consist of 2 kind of usually Greek elements to kind of refer to pathology, that was kind of a trend that kind of developed obviously in the 19th century. So we have something like that. So to just to conclusion, the results suggest that there is some depersonalization with respect to certain aspects. So for example, the shift away from narrative, ego-centered accounts to more general perspectives, like represented by for use of first person and past tense. But no depersonalization with respect to others, like evaluation and fragmentation. And no dramatic changes, no linear development, no exponential development at all. No, the kind of interpretation is possibly that he overstated, Jewson overstated the kind of depersonalization aspect, but also methodological problems with the study. Of course, the corpus is unsystematically compiled. The perspective is sometimes too general, not taking into account the lexical and semantic differentiations, and the approach might be too deductive. And in the interpretation, you also have to take into account kind of competing generic conventions and other conceptual strategies that might counteract depersonalization.
I can see that there are like approach or more multivariate specific methods that might be able to combine together.
It's a great idea, but I haven't, and I'm not sure I have the competence for.
It might simply be to try to put some of the graphs together so that you can just visually try to check if any of the features are covariant. So say, for example, in the, I think with the grammatical, the normalization slide, it looked like there might have been an inflection point around 1790.
Yeah.
And it might be nice to put the other graphs on it and say, okay, no maths, just my eyes, but it looked like there might be covariation. By the way, Matt, could you just do some maths on this?
Yeah, it's like that's the bad thing about doing this.
Sometimes simply eyeball the things, and then I think maybe there's covariation. I just put the graphs together and then try and just see visually, as you've got normalized numbers, whether there might be some covariation, and then think, okay, there might be something to look at. Just a thought.
By the way, I did it for a kind of with a smaller corpus, but I did it for to the present time, and actually you see a steep increase after 1900
okay, so
for nominalization at least.
Good visual evidence.
Jos very much because we find something similar ones, but we they not it was so complicated. So we tried with our opera, and I know how difficult it is. So I was convinced that you have very good results here, and perhaps the course somehow streamlining the data, as you suggested, might help. But I think that this is a very nice frame and very nice print of sort of analytical detail, and the analytical detail was quite great. So I appreciate it very much.
Yeah, hi. That was a great presentation. Thank you. I was just wondering, you mentioned that you did the same kind of research in the present day medicine, and what does depersonalization look like in present day medicine? How is it reduced?
In science, it looks kind of extremely, because of course in 1900 we didn't have like double-blind studies with lots of patients, so there is of course no reference to individuals at all, and like of course it's like in medicine as a practice that at least there have been attempts to kind of reverse that, but for evidence-based medicine we need this kind of really depersonalized studies probably.
What treatments, like GP practices? Just normal medicine, like GP practices.
No, I didn't look at that, so I'm not aware. Like, yeah, but it's kind of probably it is kind of grown farther apart, the practice and the science.
Question there. She's been waiting very patiently.
Yeah, thanks a lot for this talk. Very interesting. And I was impressed, especially by the changes of the use of present tense and past tense. And I think if we take those occurrences as cultures indices, maybe for narratives in the narrow sense, do you think this goes against less narrative all the time? And could we see this as an index for narrativity? Or?
Yeah. Because like the philosophical transactions of the 18th century had like, it was really kind of initially, of course, somehow letters where you kind of describe what happened. And you try to go away a little bit from this during, not completely, because you still have that, but there's definitely a tendency towards kind of making it a little bit less narrative. And it kind of, I assume that it goes completely away in the present time, where it just describe the procedures sometimes in the past tense, but otherwise you don't have the past tense.
Well, if we step lively, we may get the last two questions in. Carla first.
Thank you. That's really interesting. I did a study on passive voice and first person, second person pronouns using the philosophical transactions and a modern corpus of medical articles. And unfortunately, I can't remember all of the results, but I was very happy that they seem to be in line with what you were finding out for up to 1900, because we were amazed that we didn't find passive voice or a rise or a decrease, anything happening with what we were looking at and wondering what went wrong. The modern stuff looks better, but it seems that the shift is then much later than even 1900.
Yeah, 19 and 90, even 1950, because it really kind of exponential with, at least with normalizations.
Squeeze in one more.
Thank you very much. I think it's terribly important, this matter of a holistic and patient-based approach. But looking then at medical journals, as you were in the latter part of your corpus there, then the medical journals will actually require of the person to get their paper accepted, that they actually depersonalize things, as someone publishing and that sort of thing. You know, you're not allowed to use patient names, or that you in fact, think about patients and so on. Was there any effect, you think?
I think I just saw that because I was wondering, because you have this kind of tradition in the 19th century novels that you have Mr. and then you have an underline? No. And you have that kind of anonymous. It's not like that they are not mentioned. It's just that Mr.
Yeah.
You have that increasingly. Yeah. And from 1850, 1860 kind of names are less important. But of course, it's like the doctors are mentioned and the specialists and the peers, etc., but not the patients.
Then from the journals that you.
Yeah, I don't know.
Couple of observations before we finish then. I think that's a very interesting observation from a CDA perspective. Look at the production side and see how much the behaviour is being regulated by gatekeepers in publishing, because a sort of discourse historical approach to publishing practices might actually give you some of the explanation of what you see in the text because of the actions of gatekeepers. The other thing I kept on thinking about, so I often think about it when I was looking at your results, especially around pronouns, is you may actually see shifts, of course, in the nature of the social actors and what they're licensed to do in these accounts. So that might be a different lens to put on data and say, okay, if I just look at it in terms of social actor theory, say, given that they're not being removed from the text, what's happening with the patient, what are they licensed to do, or what's happening with the practitioner, what are they licensed to do, and to see whether actually the social roles of the show. But great work, Georg. I really enjoyed it. So thank you very much.